On this Georgia plantation, 4 powerful families were destroyed, not by rebellion, not by violence, but by a silent slave woman who never touched a weapon. They said she seduced them. They said she was a curse. But the truth they buried was far more terrifying. The first thing people noticed about her was not her beauty, but her silence. On the Georgia plantation, where hundreds of slaves worked from dawn until their backs gave out, silence was rare. Pain made noise. Chains made noise. Orders, whips, prayers, and cries filled the air every day. But she moved through that noise like a shadow that made none of her own. She kept her eyes lowered, her steps measured, her breath steady, as if she had learned long ago that sound invited attention, and attention invited suffering. The older slaves noticed her first. They whispered that she watched more than she spoke, that she listened even when she seemed far away. They said she remembered everything. At night, when the fields rested and the big house glowed with lamplight, her name was avoided. Not because it was forbidden, but because it felt dangerous. People believed that speaking certain names aloud after dark invited misfortune. On this plantation, her name joined that list. No one could explain why. She had not attacked anyone. She had not run. She had not cursed the masters or challenged authority. Yet something about her presence made people uneasy, like the quiet before a storm that no one else could see coming. She arrived young, barely grown, brought in with a small group after a neighboring estate collapsed under debt. Her wrists were thin, her clothes worn, her face unreadable. While others cried or trembled, she stood still, studying her surroundings with eyes that missed nothing. The overseer mistook that stillness for obedience. The master mistook it for weakness. Both were wrong, though it would take years for that truth to surface. From the beginning, she understood something many never did. Survival was not only about strength, but about perception. She learned the rhythms of the plantation quickly, the hours when the masters were kindest, the moments when their tempers flared, the way a compliment could protect you or a glance could condemn you. She learned which doors creaked, which staircases echoed, which voices carried through walls. While others survived day to day, she survived moment to moment, always thinking 2 steps ahead. The women of the big house sensed the change before the men did. They noticed how conversations paused when the girl entered the room, how eyes followed her even when they tried not to. It was not that she sought attention, she never did. But attention found her anyway, drawn by something subtle and unsettling. She did not smile too much. She did not lower herself in exaggerated obedience. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that felt out of place, almost threatening, in a world built on domination. Whispers began among the wives and daughters. They said the slave girl walked too confidently, that her silence was an act, that she knew things she shouldn't. Fear, once planted, grows quickly in confined spaces. Every glance became suspicious. Every moment she spent near the master's study or the main hall was questioned. Jealousy took root, fed by insecurity and long, lonely evenings in houses built on stolen labor and unspoken guilt. The men noticed her differently. At first she was simply another face among many, another body bent beneath the sun, but over time they began to seek her presence without understanding why. A request for water, an errand that did not need running, a question asked twice just to hear her voice. When she spoke, it was softly, carefully, never more than necessary. That restraint made her words linger longer than shouting ever could. She understood the danger of being noticed, yet she also understood the danger of being invisible. Invisible slaves were expendable, forgotten, replaced without question. She walked a narrow line, allowing herself to be seen but never fully known. It was a balance that required constant awareness, and she maintained it with a patience that felt almost unnatural for someone so young. The older slaves warned her in quiet moments. They told her to lower her eyes more, to shrink herself, to become smaller. They'd seen girls like her before, girls who drew attention and paid for it dearly. She listened. Respectfully, but she did not change. Not because she was reckless, but because she believed something deeper, that fear controlled those who denied it. And she refused to live entirely in fear, even if fear surrounded her. As months passed, the atmosphere on the plantation shifted. Small arguments broke out in the big house. The master's wife grew sharper, more distant. Servants were questioned more harshly. Punishments became unpredictable. Though no one said it aloud, many blamed her. It was easier to blame a slave than to confront the cracks forming within powerful families. She felt the eyes on her constantly now, not only from above but from beside her. Some slaves avoided her, afraid her presence would bring trouble. Others watched her with a mix of awe and resentment. She became isolated, not by chains but by reputation. And still she remained calm, still she observed. At night, lying on a thin mattress in the quarters, she replayed conversations in her mind. She remembered tones, pauses, words left unfinished. She understood that people revealed more in what they hid than in what they said. That knowledge became her shield. She learned when to step forward and when to disappear, when to answer and when silence was safer than truth. What no one realized, not the masters, not their wives, not even the slaves who feared her, was that the plantation had already been rotting long before she arrived. Secrets, betrayals, and unspoken desires had existed for generations. She did not create them. She simply stood still long enough for others to reveal themselves around her. By the end of her first year, her name carried weight. It was spoken cautiously, sometimes with anger, sometimes with fascination. Children were warned not to linger near her. Wives watched her hands, her posture, her expressions. Men struggled with thoughts they refused to acknowledge. The plantation felt tighter, tenser, as if everyone sensed that something irreversible had begun. And through it all, she remained exactly what she had been on the day she arrived, quiet, observant, and patient. She did not know yet how many lives would unravel in her shadow. She did not know how fear would reshape her into something larger than herself. All she knew was that survival required understanding power, and that power, once exposed, had a way of destroying those who believed they controlled it. This was how the story began. Not with violence, not with seduction, but with silence. She learned very early that strength was useless if it announced itself. On the plantation, loud slaves were broken first. Defiant ones were made examples of. The ones who survived longest were those who understood how to bend without appearing weak, how to adapt without disappearing. She watched this truth unfold every day, storing it quietly inside her. What others mistook for beauty was, in her mind, simply awareness of posture, of timing, of how humans revealed their desires when they thought no. One was watching. She never flirted the way people expected flirtation to look. There was no exaggerated smile, no deliberate touch, no lowering of her dress or batting of her eyes. That would have been obvious, dangerous. Instead, her power lived in restraint, a pause before answering, a glance that lingered just long enough to feel accidental, a soft reply that invited a man to lean closer without her ever moving an inch. She allowed others to believe they were leading when in truth they were following impulses they barely understood. Men on the plantation were used to obedience. They confused control with worth, desire with entitlement. Around her, that certainty began to weaken. They found themselves thinking about her at odd moments, during dinner, during prayer, during arguments with their wives. It unsettled them. They told themselves it meant nothing, that she was just a slave, and yet, the more they tried to dismiss her, the more she occupied their thoughts. She noticed the shift before anyone else did. She could hear it in the change of tone when her name was spoken, feel it in the hesitation before commands were given. She recognized curiosity disguised as authority. She understood that attention once earned could not be undone, and so she became careful, never greedy for it, never careless. She treated attention like fire, useful in small amounts, deadly if allowed to spread. There were moments when she was summoned for tasks that required no skill, standing nearby while a master searched for a document, carrying an item that could have been fetched by anyone. She understood the unspoken purpose of these requests. She complied calmly, never showing discomfort, never showing interest. Her neutrality became the most confusing thing about her. Men expected fear or eagerness. They received neither. The women of the household sensed the imbalance immediately. A wife could feel when her place was threatened, even if the threat was invisible. They watched their husbands' eyes linger too long, their tempers shorten too quickly. They noticed how conversations stopped when the slave girl entered the room, how the air seemed heavier in her presence. Anger grew, sharpened by humiliation they could not name without exposing their own vulnerability. She became a silent rival without ever claiming the role. That was the cruelest part. She did not compete, she did not challenge, she simply existed, and that existence forced others to confront truths they had spent years avoiding. The wives tightened their control, issuing stricter rules, harsher punishments. They believed discipline would restore order. Instead, it only revealed how fragile that order had always been. She understood something the plantation owners never did. Desire is most dangerous when it is denied. The more the men tried to suppress it, the more it poisoned their thoughts. The more the women tried to control it, the more it slipped through their fingers. She did nothing to encourage the chaos, yet she knew how to navigate it. She learned which moments required distance, which moments demanded presence. She learned when absence spoke louder than availability. In quiet corners of the estate, she listened. She listened to complaints disguised as jokes, to confessions framed as commands. She absorbed information without reacting, storing it carefully. Knowledge, she realized, was leverage, not to be used openly, but to be held like a hidden blade, never shown, always felt. Some men began to believe they understood her. That belief made them careless. They spoke more freely around her, revealing dissatisfaction, resentment, fantasies they could never voice to their wives. She offered no advice, no comfort. She simply listened. And in listening, she allowed them to expose the fractures already running through their lives. To the outside world, nothing seemed to change. The plantation functioned as it always had. Crops were harvested, meals were served, orders were given and obeyed, but beneath that routine, something had shifted permanently. Trust began to erode. Suspicion crept into places once considered secure. And though many blamed her, deep down they knew the truth was more unsettling, that she had not created desire, only removed the illusion that it could be controlled. She was aware of the danger she walked every day. One accusation, one rumor spoken too loudly could destroy her, and yet she continued forward with careful confidence. Not because she believed herself untouchable, but because she believed fear alone was a slow death. If she was going to survive, it would not be by shrinking into nothingness. At night, when the plantation finally slept, she lay awake replaying every interaction. She evaluated what she had revealed and what she had concealed. She adjusted her behavior like a strategist refining a plan. This was not manipulation for pleasure or revenge. It was survival sharpened into an art. What no one realized was that her so-called weapon was not beauty at all. Beauty fades. Beauty invites possession. What she wielded was understanding, of human weakness, of power disguised as morality, of how easily people destroyed themselves when confronted with what they wanted but could not admit. By the end of that year, the plantation no longer felt stable. Arguments erupted over small things, marriages grew colder, loyalty fractured quietly, invisibly, and always, somewhere in the background, was the silent figure of the slave girl, blamed for changes she never initiated. She did not celebrate this influence. She did not even fully acknowledge it. She simply moved forward, aware that every step drew her deeper into a role she had never chosen. A role that would soon transform her from a woman trying to survive into a symbol of fear others would use to explain their own collapse. And still, she said very little, because she knew the most powerful weapon she possessed was the one no one could take from her, the ability to let others destroy themselves while believing they were in control. The collapse did not happen all at once. It never does. It began quietly, almost politely, with small changes that were easy to dismiss. A raised voice where there had once been patience, a door closed too firmly, a meal eaten in silence. On the surface, the four families tied to the plantation still appeared powerful, respected, unshaken. But beneath the polished routines and forced smiles, something fragile was cracking, and everyone felt it. In the first house, the master had always been known as fair by plantation standards, controlled, predictable. His wife trusted that predictability, built her entire sense of safety around it. When his behavior shifted, she noticed immediately. He grew distant, distracted. He lingered longer in rooms where the slave girl had recently worked. When questioned, he became defensive, offended by the implication rather than concerned by her fear. That defensiveness hurt more than any confession could have. Trust, once bent, never fully straightens again. The wife began to watch everything. She counted steps in hallways. She measured time spent away from her side. She questioned servants harshly, desperate to reclaim control. In her mind, the slave girl became the enemy, not because of what she had done, but because of what her presence symbolized: vulnerability. Admitting that her husband's desires were his own would mean confronting a truth too painful to accept. Blame was easier. In the second family, the damage ran deeper and faster. The master's son noticed the tension before anyone else. He saw how his father's attention drifted, how his mother's laughter faded into bitterness. Confusion turned into resentment. He began to despise the weakness he sensed in his father, though he could not name it. That resentment grew poisonous, turning admiration into contempt. A family once united by status and pride now sat divided by unspoken accusations. The third household unraveled through silence rather than conflict. Husband and wife stopped speaking honestly, choosing politeness over truth. They avoided eye contact, avoided difficult conversations, avoided acknowledging the distance growing between them. The slave girl's name was never spoken there, but her shadow lingered in every unsaid word. Silence became their punishment, slow and suffocating. The fourth family was the most volatile. Arguments exploded openly, plates shattered, doors slammed, the wife accused, the husband denied. Both were trapped in roles they no longer recognized. Fear turned into rage, and rage demanded an outlet. Once again, the slave girl became the easiest target. Punishments were increased, restrictions tightened, control was mistaken for justice. Across all four families, the pattern was the same. They were not being destroyed by an outsider. They were collapsing under the weight of their own contradictions. The plantation system demanded obedience while encouraging exploitation, morality while rewarding cruelty. The slave girl simply existed within that system, and in her presence, the lies holding it together began to fall apart. She felt the change in the air long before the consequences reached her. People stopped meeting her eyes. Conversations halted when she approached. Orders became sharper, less patient. She understood what was happening. Fear had found a shape, and her body had been chosen to wear it. The realization did not shock her. It saddened her, but it did not surprise her. Among the slaves, opinions were divided. Some believed she was cursed, that disaster followed her like a shadow. Others saw her as a warning, proof that even quiet strength could provoke violence in a system built on insecurity. A few admired her, though they would never say it aloud. Admiration, like hope, was dangerous. The masters, meanwhile, struggled with something they could not control themselves. Desire twisted into shame, shame turned into anger, anger demanded punishment, and punishment, when misdirected, only deepened the fracture. Each family told itself a different story to survive the discomfort. Some claimed they were victims, others claimed they were restoring order. None admitted the truth. The slave girl moved carefully now, more aware than ever of how close danger hovered. She reduced her presence, avoided attention, softened her movements. But it was too late to erase what had already been projected onto her. Once a symbol is created, it no longer belongs to the person it represents. It belongs to those who fear it. Late at night, voices carried through walls, arguments, accusations, sobbing. She listened not out of curiosity, but because she could not escape it. Their pain seeped into the air, heavy and unavoidable. She wondered if any of them understood how little power she truly held, how she had never intended to disrupt anything, how survival, in a place like this, was always misunderstood. One by one, the families began to fracture publicly. A master dismissed trusted staff in fits of suspicion. A wife withdrew from social gatherings, humiliated by whispers she could not silence. A son left the plantation early, unable to bear the tension choking the household. These were not dramatic collapses, they were quiet retreats, slow losses of dignity and unity. Still, the story people told was simple, too simple. They said one woman had caused it all. That narrative spread easily because it allowed everyone else to remain innocent. It allowed power to remain unquestioned. And so the legend grew. She watched the consequences unfold with a heavy awareness she could never share. She knew that if she disappeared tomorrow, the damage would remain. The cracks were too deep, the truth too exposed. But she also knew she would never be forgiven for revealing what others had worked so hard to hide. By the time the fourth family finally broke beyond repair, the plantation no longer felt like a home to anyone. It felt like a place holding its breath, waiting for something worse to happen. Fear had replaced certainty, control had replaced trust. And in that unstable silence, the slave girl understood something clearly for the first time. She had not destroyed these families, they had destroyed themselves, and she would carry the blame for the rest of her life. Yet even as the weight of that blame pressed down on her, she remained standing, quiet, observant, unbroken, because in a world that punished truth, endurance itself became an act of defiance. The moment she stopped being spoken about openly was the moment she stopped being seen as human. At first, people still used her name cautiously, as if it carried weight. Then the name itself became dangerous. Conversations lowered when she passed. Mothers pulled their children closer. Men straightened their backs, as though reminding themselves who they were supposed to be. Somewhere along the way she crossed an invisible line, from a person blamed for unrest to something people feared without understanding why. Rumors filled the silence her name left behind. They grew in the spaces where truth was avoided. Some said she bewitched men with nothing more than her eyes. Others whispered that she carried a curse, that misfortune followed her footsteps like a shadow. The stories contradicted one another, yet all pointed to the same conclusion. She was no longer just a slave. She was an explanation. And explode. Nations are powerful when people are desperate to avoid responsibility. She felt the change in how the guards watched her. Their eyes lingered longer, sharper, no longer curious but cautious. They tracked her movements, noted where she stood, how long she stayed. Rules that had never existed before seemed to form around her alone. She was assigned tasks that kept her isolated. She was moved from place to place, never allowed to settle. Control disguised itself as protection, but she recognized it for what it was, fear tightening its grip. The women of the plantation hardened toward her completely. Any remaining restraint disappeared. Orders were delivered with clipped cruelty. Punishments were issued without hesitation. Yet beneath that anger lived something fragile and trembling. She could see it in their hands, in the way their voices cracked when they raised them. They were not punishing her to restore order. They were punishing her to quiet their own terror. The men, too, had changed. Those who once sought her presence now avoided her entirely, as though distance could erase memory. When forced to speak to her, they did so stiffly, formally, as if she was something volatile that might explode if mishandled. Their fear was not of her actions, but of their own thoughts around her, thoughts they had been raised to believe made them weak. She understood then that fear had rewritten her story without her consent. It no longer mattered what she did or did not do. Every glan, every movement was interpreted through the legend forming around her. If she spoke, it was manipulation. If she remained silent, it was plotting. There was no correct choice once a person becomes a symbol. Among the slaves, the distance widened as well. Some avoided her entirely, terrified that association alone would invite punishment. Others watched her with a quiet reverence, as though she represented something they could not name but desperately wanted to believe in. Strength, control, resistance that did not require violence. But admiration was dangerous, and so it remained hidden behind careful neutrality. At night, stories about her spread faster than truth ever could. They passed through whispers, growing darker with each retelling. Children were told not to look at her. New arrivals were warned to stay away. Fear transformed her into something larger than life, something unreal. And once she became unreal, anything could be believed about her. She heard fragments of these stories and felt a strange detachment. The woman they described did not feel like her. That woman was powerful, intentional, almost mythical. She was simply surviving, adjusting her steps day by day. Yet she understood why the myth existed. People needed it. It allowed them to organize their fear into something they could point at. The plantation itself began to feel different. Where it had once been tense, it now felt brittle, as though one wrong movement could shatter everything. Authority relied less on routine and more on force. Laughter disappeared. Even the masters seemed uneasy in their own homes, haunted by a presence they had helped create. She became careful in new ways, not smaller but sharper. She measured her words more precisely. She avoided places where shadows gathered. She learned to read not just intention, but anticipation, the moment before violence, before accusation. Survival now required a deeper awareness than ever before. There were moments when she felt the weight of it pressing against her chest. Moments when exhaustion crept in and she wondered how long a person could carry a legend without breaking beneath it. But even then, she did not crumble. Because somewhere deep inside, she recognized the truth others refused to see. Fear had given her a strange kind of power, whether she wanted it or not. That power was not authority, it was not safety, it was influence born from uncertainty. People adjusted their behavior around her, decisions were made with her in mind, conversations changed shape because of her absence or presence. She had become a force within the plantation's psychological landscape, shaping outcomes without lifting a hand. She did not celebrate this. She did not seek to use it. She endured it. And endurance, in a world built to erase people like her, was itself a quiet rebellion. One evening as the sun fell low and the plantation held its breath in that uneasy hour between work and night, she stood alone near the GE of the fields. She watched the buildings that had once felt solid now loom like fragile masks. She understood then that the fear surrounding her was not really about her at all. It was about guilt, about desire, about power built on cruelty and sustained by denial. She was simply the mirror they could not look away from. By the time the legend fully took hold, there was no turning back. She would never again be just a woman trying to survive. She was now a story told in whispers, a warning, a curse, a living reminder of everything this world refused to confront about itself. And still she remained, quiet, observant, alive. Because legends are born when truth becomes too dangerous to face. The truth arrived without drama. No confrontation, no confession spoken aloud. It settled slowly like dust after a collapse, revealing what had always been there beneath the noise. By the time anyone was willing to see it, the damage was already done. 4 families stood fractured, their authority weakened, their dignity thinned to performance, and still they searched for someone to blame, because blame was easier than truth. She stood at the center of that blame, though she had never asked to be there. In every retelling, her role grew darker, more deliberate. She was described as calculating, dangerous, intentional. The idea that she had simply existed, quietly, observantly, was unbearable. If she had planned their downfall, then they were victims. If she had seduced them, then they were powerless. That version of the story protected what little pride they had left. But beneath the legend, beneath the fear, something undeniable remained. Every choice that led to ruin had been freely made. The first family tried to recover by pretending nothing had happened. Publicly they smiled. Privately they lived like strangers. The master avoided his wife's eyes. The wife avoided mirrors. Their home still stood, but it no longer felt lived in. The slave girl had been reassigned, moved farther away, as if distance could erase memory. It didn't. Silence became their inheritance. The second family fractured completely. The son left early, carrying resentment he would never speak aloud. The parents remained, bound by obligation rather than affection. They blamed her openly, casually, as if repetition could turn accusation into fact. Yet in quiet moments, when no one was watching, guilt flickered across their faces. They knew. They had always known. The third family faded socially. Invitations stopped. Whispers followed them. Respect drained away not because of scandal, but because of visible decay. Their restraint, once admired, now looked like emptiness. The truth had hollowed them out, and no story could fill the space it left behind. The fourth family collapsed publicly and violently. Accusations spilled into the open. Blame turned inward. Punishments grew harsher, not just toward slaves, but toward one another. The master drank more. The wife hardened beyond recognition. Their household became an example of excess, of what happened when power lost its mask. Through all of this, she remained alive. That alone felt like an offense to those who wanted a clean ending. They had hoped for her disappearance, sold, punished, erased, something that would allow them to close the chapter without reflection. But she endured, and her endurance forced the truth to linger. Among the slaves, the narrative shifted slowly. Fear gave way to understanding, not admiration, not celebration, but clarity. They saw how easily power crumbled when confronted by its own reflection. They saw how quickly those who claimed control fell apart when their desires surfaced. And they saw how a system built on domination could not survive honesty, even accidental honesty. She never claimed innocence. She never defended herself. There was no audience willing to listen anyway. Instead, she lived with a quiet awareness that truth did not require her voice. It revealed itself through consequence. Years passed. New rumors replaced old ones. New faces arrived, unaware of the legend they were stepping into. Yet traces of her story remained embedded in the plantation's behavior. Rules shaped by fear, distance shaped by memory, control tightened where trust once pretended to exist. The families had changed forever, even if they refused to admit why. One evening, long after the worst had passed, she stood near the quarters and watched the sun lower itself behind the fields. She thought about how easily truth was twisted when spoken by the powerful, and how rarely the powerless were believed. She thought about how survival had been mistaken for manipulation, how awareness had been confused with threat. She understood then that history would never tell her story accurately. It would flatten her into a symbol, either monster or myth. The truth was quieter, more uncomfortable. She had not destroyed 4 families. She had not seduced power away from them. She had simply existed in a space where their contradictions could no longer hide. That realization did not bring comfort. It brought clarity. The plantation system depended on silence from those it oppressed and ignorance from those who benefited. She had broken neither rule intentionally, but her presence disrupted the balance anyway. In a world built on denial, awareness alone was enough to cause collapse. The final irony was this: those who feared her most were the ones who saw themselves most clearly through her. And rather than accept what they saw, they chose to shatter everything else. As she walked back toward the quarters, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, she carried no triumph, only understanding. Understanding that truth does not need permission to exist, that power fears reflection more than rebellion, and that sometimes the most feared person in a broken world is the one who exposes what was already rotten. Her story did not end with redemption or punishment, it ended with survival, and in a place designed to strip people of even that, survival was the most dangerous truth of all.